This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. So, this is something a bit different. My channel is about dissecting racing games, Gran Turismo in particular. My big break came from my series breaking down Gran Turismo 7, and all of the ways in which I found it disappointing. And over the past year, I've received many comments along the lines of, well, how would you fix GT7? And what would your version of Gran Turismo look like? And I thought to myself, instead of trying to make an action plan of how I would attempt to improve this, in my opinion, severely broken game, I would do one better. So, I have spent the past several months forming a blueprint for my own Gran Turismo style racing game. And what I'm going to do in this video is share it with you all. So, let's get started. But before we get started, have you ever heard of the Nordschleifer? No? Didn't think so. But what about NordVPN? Yeah, you probably do. And that's for a very good reason. But even still, the fine people over at NordVPN have enlisted my help to spread the word even further. When I make my videos, I sometimes have to do quite a bit of research, and that occasionally leads me to some sketchy, unprotected websites. But with NordVPN, I no longer have to worry about my data being stolen and ending up on the dark web, because Nord is a virtual private network, which encrypts your data, thus hiding your online activity from people with malicious intent. And that's just one of the things NordVPN can do. It can also grant you access to region-locked content, which is very useful on your favorite streaming services, for example. And even better is that Nord currently have a deal for a 2-year plan with an extra 4 months for free. That's right, 4 whole months for free. Use my link nordvpn.com/rofflewaffle and check out NordVPN today, as you'll not only be helping yourself, but helping the channel as well. Many thanks to Nord for sponsoring this segment, and now on with the show. Right, before we dive in, I just want to say that all of this is just for fun really. The main goals of this video are to share my thoughts and of course entertain all of you. That said, I am still treating this as if it were a reasonably serious game proposal for a new racing game IP developed by a small but passionate group of people. Of course, I'll try and provide supporting footage for what I'll be talking about. My ability to create mock-ups and the like is severely limited, so what I'll be doing at points is showing footage from other racing games which do similar things to express my point. Of course, not everything I want to put in this hypothetical game can be shown in other games, so just bear in mind that sometimes the visuals may not match what I'm actually talking about. Okay then, let's start with the premise. As I've said, this is not necessarily intended to be a Gran Turismo sequel, but a racing game in the style of Gran Turismo that hits many of the same beats. So I'm calling this blueprint Project Leggera. Leggera being Italian for light, as in lightweight. Why that name in particular? Well, firstly it's Italian, and as we all know, every good racing game has to have an Italian name. Just see my favourite games, Grand Touring, Force, and Race Trim for proof. But mainly because it's my belief that racing games in this style have kind of lost focus. How many times have you driven the latest and greatest hypercar or GT3 race car at tracks like Spa or the Nürburgring with gorgeous, almost photorealistic visuals? My guess is very often in many different games. Leggera would almost be the antithesis to that. The focus will be on normal cars, ranging from daily commuters to sports cars and attainable dream cars. These are the cars that I believe are actually relevant to real people who love cars, and as such acts as a great counterpoint to the numerous current races that seem to move away from this demographic. In this sense, Leggera refers to not only the types of cars you would see in the game, but also to the ethos of the game itself, being more stripped back and focused on what really matters for the gameplay. We'll get to the car list itself in a moment, but I just want to touch on the technical side first. Some people will tell you that the visuals and graphics don't really matter, but this isn't true. They do matter a lot. The visuals will be people's first impression of the game, so it has to leave a good mark. That said, ultra fidelity and realism don't matter as much as some AAA developers and publishers would prefer you to believe. So when it comes to Leggera, the visual style would be simplified but stylized, particularly in terms of lighting and visual effects. I'm going to mention Gran Turismo 3 quite a few times in this video, and that's for very good reasons. PS2 visuals still look decent today. Mods for these older games really show what's still possible, even with a lower level of accuracy. And talking about GT3 specifically, it's always looked very unique because of its visual style. Certain lighting conditions, like sunsets, are very distinct from any other GT game. As from GT4 onwards, we started to see a shift towards a more washed out, but more realistic visual style. GT3 also pioneered many small visual effects, like sparks coming from underneath the cars as they ride over curbs, a heat haze rising from the track, and rays of light shining down from between the trees. This visual identity is what I would want to tap into, but for the modern age. So relatively simplified models and environments, by today's standards, but much more emphasis placed on the lighting and visual effects to give a more pronounced style that would very much set it apart from the competition. I call this idea PS2 Plus visuals. It wouldn't look as detailed as these more realistic racing games, but would have far more personality and visual flair to make up for that, while still feeling relatable to real life. It wouldn't be too far over the top. It would also allow for more flexibility in terms of what we could do with the game, as all of the assets would take far less time to produce. Another benefit of this is consistency. The fact that as we're not aiming for ultra realism, there isn't as much pressure to keep things super consistent. Think about the reused car models from Forza, or the rain on your windscreen effect from GT7. The issue with these isn't just that they look bad, it's that they're complete outliers when compared to the visuals in other parts of the game, and not consistent with the narrative we're given as consumers for top-of-the-line graphics. Now, when it comes to the handling, of course realism is good, but again, it's about those diminishing returns. The better it handles, the more time it'll take to refine, and the less benefit you'll see with each improvement. Again, if we think back to GT3, the handling of that game is in a real sweet spot for me personally. It feels responsive and intuitive, but versatile enough to work for a large range of cars. It feels great to drive on a gamepad, but also very good with a wheel. It pulls from real life in the best ways, but is simplified enough to work on the PS2 hardware. Of course, I don't want to put a lid on what's possible, but if we were to do something similar, then that would make the cars feel weighty and real in a sense, but still plenty of fun for casual players who an ultra-realistic handling model would be lost on. It would also again help to reduce production times. Sound will also be important. With modern Gran Turismo, they tend to be a bit more reserved, but I think it's good to play up this aspect even if it's not 100% accurate. As long as the sounds aren't laughably off, then I believe it would be fine to exaggerate them a little bit and really add to the spectacle of the whole thing. That would also match well with the visual style. Now to the car list. I didn't really need to come up with a full car list for this proposal, but I wanted to anyway because it'll make the video better, and I just thought it would be fun. So without further ado, here it is. So quite a few things to explain here. First is that I've only listed generic model names and generations, like Nissan Skyline R34, but not specified the spec, like Skyline GTR for example. I'll explain that in a bit. Also, some cars do have years next to their name, but that's just to specify between a name which has been given to multiple different cars, like the Alfa Romeo Giulia for instance. Also, on one side you'll be seeing pictures of some of the more obscure and lesser known cars on the list. So how did I come up with this list? Of course, many of these cars I've always known about from various media, including other racing games. A handful I came across whilst researching specifically for this video, and a few I actually first found out about by seeing them in real life. Also, shout out to a book I have called Top Gear: The Cool 500, where again a few more of these picks came from. So from this list you can see what I'm aiming for. The cars range from bottom of the barrel basics like the Citroen Saxo, Chevy Spark and Nissan Micra, through to higher end sports cars like the current Porsche 911 and C8 Corvette. In terms of what you won't find on this list, there are quite a few omissions. Proper supercars and hypercars are out. Nothing against these types of cars, but they just don't really fit with the game when it comes to having relatable cars, and of course their oversaturation in other races means that I don't have a massive urge to include them either. Also, from a personal standpoint, I'm not that interested in them and don't often find them that fun to drive in racing games. They're far too point and squirt for me. There aren't too many classic cars either. This was a painful decision to make because I do like plenty of classic cars and they would fit with the whole leggera/lightweight theme. But from a gameplay perspective, they're not the most versatile, so when it came to making cuts, they had to go. Electric cars also aren't featured, and that's mostly just down to the types of electric cars out there at the moment. Most fit into one of two categories: family crossovers and SUVs, or overpowered hypercars, neither of which I'm all that interested in, and I don't see great potential for them in a track racing game like this. Sadly, there aren't very many enthusiast or even just reasonable performance electric cars, so I made the choice to cut them entirely. But as EVs become more widespread and we see more variety in them, this will change. There would always be the potential to add these types of cars at a later date as DLC or even in a sequel. But the benefit of streamlining the car list as I've done is that I was able to really flesh out the list of what I consider relevant cars. As I say, the types of cars that I believe matter the most to real people and also could have a key role in your playthrough of the game should you wish them to. An unfortunate trend in modern racing games is having joke cars. You see it in Forza all the time, with stuff like the Isetta, Reliant Supervan, and the Limo. Even Gran Turismo has gotten in on this somewhat, with cars like the Willys Jeep and Abarth 595, which you can do ridiculous engine swaps with. Cars that are practically useless in the main game and are just there to mess around with before you get bored and move on to something else. There are none of those on this list. Every car will have at least some amount of functional purpose. But weird and quirky cars are interesting, and can give a game a lot of personality. So what I've done is to include many lesser known and obscure cars, sports cars in particular. The world of forgotten sports cars is really interesting, and there are so many cool and unique cars that hardly anyone remembers. These will be mostly the cars you're seeing on screen, and I hope this inspires a few of you to do some googling and check them out, because I think they're fascinating and many deserve to be immortalized in a racing game. I haven't counted, but I'd estimate of the cars on this list, 100 of them are cars that cannot be driven in any current racing games, and maybe 30 or so have never featured in any racing game ever. Of course, this does raise a logistical issue of how one would go about getting the license to use some of these cars, and there's no real easy solution to that. The only upside is that we wouldn't have to deal with many premium brands like Ferrari, Lamborghini, and McLaren, as their cars don't feature here. But a few concept cars are included, which of course aren't that relevant to people, but are interesting and do add a unique flavour. Once again, the goal was to include cars that could be usable in the game should you wish to do so, even if they are concepts. The whole leggera, lightweight theme also means I haven't listed any luxury cars and was somewhat reluctant when it came to muscle cars. In the end, I did decide to put on the more influential muscle and pony cars, like the Mustang and Camaro, because of course they are relevant for many people and would serve a decent purpose in the game. Although there isn't a huge number of them, but again, this could be expanded later. In total, there are 482 cars on this list, representing 73 manufacturers and 16 different countries. Now, I won't lie, I didn't intend for this list to grow so big. As I was making it, I always had a rough target number in mind, but I just had to keep pushing that up further and further as I went down the list, until I ended up with almost 500 cars. One of the key themes of the game is being focused and streamlining everything to create the best gameplay experience. Part of that would have been showing that you don't need to include every car ever made to create an incredible gameplay experience. In some ways, having a smaller roster of cars can actually be a benefit. But of course, that point doesn't hold as much weight when my proposal has almost as many cars as the Forza Motorsport reboot. So what I decided to do was create a priority list. In essence, all of the models you see that have an asterisk before them are what I've deemed as lower priority and could be cut if necessary. When you factor out these cars, the list now totals 385 models. Still fairly sizable, but it isn't raising any eyebrows by current standards. All in all, I have to say that I am very happy with this list, as I feel like it hits all of the spots I want it to, and demonstrates what the game is all about. It would also then allow me to structure the game in the best way possible to make use of these cars in interesting and engaging ways, which we'll of course come onto later. So 482 cars. But if we were to count them in the same way that other racing games do, the number may end up being a bit higher than that. Let me explain how. Something that was really pioneered by Gran Turismo and has become almost ubiquitous with this type of racing game ever since is having multiple versions of the same car, and that idea would also be a key part of Leggera. What has become very apparent to me is that when it comes to the design decisions you make with a game, the way you portray that to the players matters almost as much as what you actually do. And this is how I came up with car variations. So the idea of duplicates is very infamous when it comes to Gran Turismo. The fact that in some games you could have 20 Mazda Roadsters that were all very slightly different, but in reality they were functionally identical. Yet the game still counted them as unique cars. Take a look at my duplicate cars video if you want to know more about that. Stuff like this is pretty egregious, but the fundamental idea of having multiple versions of the same car, I believe, is fairly solid, and this is where car variations come in. Given that the game would have reasonably basic car models, it would be pretty easy to modify them slightly to create alternative variations of many of the cars. But the key difference to Gran Turismo, and many other races which do something similar, is that they would not be counted towards the total car list. Instead, the car list would stay the same and the number of separate car variations would increase. Also, the choice of variations to include would generally have more purpose. For the most part, cars would have two variations where possible, a fairly basic spec and a higher performance spec. The basic spec is intended to represent the car as most would know it in real life, and the higher spec would be the version of the car that is most exciting and desirable to own. Let's take a look at an example. The first generation Renault Clio. The first gen Clio has featured in a couple of racing games, most notably in the Forza franchise, but whenever it's been included, it's always been the Clio Williams, a homologation special created for rallying and tuned by a Formula 1 constructor. This car is really cool, but needless to say, it doesn't have any relevance to what the Clio actually was for most people, a fairly basic super mini. For a lot of people, it was their first ever car, not a Group A WRC monster. So, to satisfy all parties, we could have two variations. The Williams, representing the car in its most exciting motorsport-derived form, and a very basic spec version like the Clio RL for example, which would seem more appropriate to most people who are actually familiar with the real car. Given that the Williams was a 2-litre with 150 horsepower, and the RL would be the 1.2 with about 55 horsepower, we could even have a third version in between the two, like the Clio RSI, which was the more attainable sporty version with a 1.8 and just over 100 horsepower. And since we're not going for supreme realism, we can take some liberties by just tweaking the performance to match the real cars and using the same basic model for all three with just minor adjustments. In this sense, it wouldn't take a huge amount of effort to produce each of them, but would add lots of value to each car, given how much more versatile it is as a platform and how each can be used differently in different parts of the game. Let's take a look at another example on the complete other end of the spectrum. The latest Porsche 911 992. The basic spec is the Carrera, and without much more work, we can make that into the Carrera GTS, or the Turbo, or even have a cabriolet version. The GT3 would probably require more work, and would be reaching the upper limit of what I'd ideally want in terms of stock car performance, but these are the options that are available. This system would also be able to represent slight model year differences. Of the early Lancer Evos, the only one I included on the list was the Evo 3, but as the 3 is just a slight evolution of the 2, which is itself a slight improvement on the 1, all of them could be included as variations of the same model. And this isn't even mentioning the numerous numbers of other JDM cars that this idea could apply to, like Mazda Roadsters, Nissan Skylines, and plenty more interesting versions of cars that you rarely, if ever, get to see in racing games these days. As long as each choice of variation serves a clear purpose, whether that be for the people who have an interest in that specific car, or just for gameplay reasons, then I see no reason why this can't be done. Of course, no matter how slight the differences are, each variation will take time to make, and some players still won't see the value in having multiple variations of the same car, even if the trade-off works out to something like 20 variations made for the same time and resources as one unique car. But what this system really does is add a layer of transparency to what is often considered a black art in racing games. Essentially, we're taking one of the most controversial aspects of racing games, one that basically never gets directly referenced by the people making the games, and have turned it into a key feature in which the reasons for and benefits it offers are clearly communicated to the players. That is the key difference, and that is why I believe in this idea. Of course, it's not just about the cars though, we also need tracks for them to race on. Once again, I've written up a track list, at least partially, so let's take a look at that. Starting with the real world circuits, I've picked 12 locations that I would want to feature. I made sure that the tracks I was choosing would fit with the car list, so there is more of a skew towards tighter, twistier circuits that are more enjoyable in lower performance cars. In the spirit of not retreading what so many racing games have already done, a lot of these circuits have likely not featured in many racing games, but each has been chosen because I think they're interesting and offer something unique. So let's go down the list. First, we have Barber Motorsports Park in the USA, with 3 different layouts, best known as a current IndyCar track. Next is Bilsterberg in Germany with 3 layouts, which has often been likened to a mini Nürburgring. Then we've got Brands Hatch with 2 layouts, a very well-known UK circuit that's fun to drive in a variety of cars. Charade is up next with 2 layouts, and was the former home of the French Grand Prix through the 60s and 70s. Then we have Ebisu in Japan with 3 layouts, although there are more, but I've only chosen the 3 most important for racing. Everland Speedway is a South Korean circuit with 5 layouts and a crossover, making it a figure 8 circuit. The Monte Carlo Street Circuit needs no introduction, but I've included 2 layouts as a shorter version was used by Formula E from 2015 to 2019. The Shogang GT circuit only has 1 layout, but is a stop-start Chinese track in a very unique setting. The Bend Motorsport Park represents Australia with its 7 layouts in total. Thunderhill Raceway Park is the second US circuit, also with 7 layouts, and is best known for hosting a 25-hour endurance race. Tsukuba Circuit in Japan is next, another very well-known circuit with 3 layouts if we include the separate 1000 course. And finally is Vallelunga in Italy with 4 layouts. 12 locations representing 10 different countries and making a combined 42 circuit layouts. My original plan was to have 20 locations total, as I felt this was reasonable given GT3 has 20 locations also, with a 10-10 split between the real locations and the fictional ones. This ended up being a 12-8 split, which isn't a massive issue, but potentially could be skewed slightly. When it comes to the fictional circuits, I would love to say that I came up with 8 unique circuit designs, but I didn't. Sadly, that would have taken far too much time, but I still came up with some circuit ideas which we'll go through now. First is what I'm calling the main hub circuit. The idea for this circuit is that it would have many layouts ranging from the very basic that you would compete at the very start of the game, to the more longer and complex which would feature in the later events. In this sense, it would pretty much be ever-present throughout the game, and I imagine the theming being somewhat similar to Grand Valley Speedway in Gran Turismo. It would be the defining circuit of the game. My second idea is for a European town circuit. Imagine Città d'Aria from GT4, but maybe a bit wider and more suited to regular racing. But there would also be a second variation that heads into the mountains, inspired by many of the great European rally stages of Monte Carlo, Corsica, and Sanremo. The start-finish would be in the town section, but in theory, this track could be a real monster in length, somewhat like Fujimi Kaido from Forza or Circuito della Sierra from GT6. Next is what I call the Twin Oval circuit. You know how in the older Gran Turismos there would always be the small oval, Super Speedway, and the big oval, Test Course? Well, the idea for the Twin Oval circuit is that they're combined into one. Of course, each oval could be driven separately, but there would also be a combined layout where the two would overlap, similar in design to Red Rock Valley from GT2. Next, I have a Desert City circuit. This one is a track that takes place on the outskirts of a large city in the middle of a desert, somewhat inspired by Las Vegas. The pits and start-finish area would be outside the city in its own section, with the route heading partially through the city itself, offering a nice dichotomy. Of course, this would be a fictional city with made-up roads that are designed to make it enjoyable to drive, unlike the real Las Vegas F1 circuit, which looks like complete shit. I also have a couple of real-world street circuits that would be fictional tracks, but based on real roads and locations. The two I've come up with are Turin in Italy and Osaka in Japan. Turin because of its importance in Italian motoring, being the home of Fiat, and Osaka because I think it's an interesting city that could offer some unique visuals. For the final two, I didn't come up with any specific ideas, but they would most likely fit some sort of general archetype, like coastal circuit and mountainous circuit. I would aim to have every track include a full 24-hour day-night cycle and complete dynamic weather system. Doing so means that it would likely be one generic weather system used for each location, but in theory, small tweaks could be made to make each of them feel distinct. The gameplay benefits of this system, when it comes to versatility and variability, far outweigh the need for total accuracy in my opinion. Okay, that's the cars and tracks taken care of, now let's dive into the meat of the game. The single-player career is without a doubt the most important aspect of this style of racing game in my opinion. If you mess it up, it is the easiest way to ensure that your game won't have much longevity and is doomed to be forgotten. So how would I tackle this? Simpler really, I just copy Gran Turismo 3. Yeah, really original. No, being serious, I've mentioned before how the classic Gran Turismo formula, win races, earn money in cars, buy more cars, upgrade cars, win more races, is pretty simple and pretty overdone, and not just by Gran Turismo. But that's because it works. It taps into the fundamental psychology of what keeps people engaged, and the version of it used in GT3 is my favourite, given the degree of difficulty it adds, not just in the moment-to-moment gameplay, but also from a long-term playthrough perspective. With that said, it still does a few things I'm not particularly fond of, and still has some areas of massive untapped potential to be unleashed. So, whilst I was being facetious about just copying GT3, in a way I also sort of wasn't. If we imagine GT3 as a car, maybe a Porsche 911 GT3, I would take that car, strip it down to the body shell, and then rebuild it with my own custom internals and exterior parts. Certain core elements of the game don't really need to be changed, but the more interesting things will be the parts we do change. So let's start from the beginning. What is the first thing you will have to do when starting a playthrough? Buy your first car. The difference with Leggera is that you will have to buy a car first. There will be license tests and other things to do in the game that you can win cars from, but to start with, you will have to buy a car and you will have to do some races. So how do the dealerships work? Well, we've got a new cars dealership and a used cars dealership. Of course, there's no used dealership in GT3, but most other GTs do have it. The used dealership will actually be split into three. One for Europe, one for USA, and one for Asia Pacific. The reason for splitting them like this is so that they're all on a level playing field, and the pricing of the cars found in them will be relative to how they're priced in their respective regions. This should alleviate some issues, such as European cars being priced considerably higher than others, thus making them pretty useless. When you look at something like Gran Turismo 2, where this is the case, it's of course based on a Japanese perspective, where this makes sense. But in terms of gameplay, it really doesn't. So that's one benefit, and allows you a wider degree of freedom in terms of which cars to start with. The cars you start with, however, will be the absolutely basic spec cars, the types of cars you most likely had as your first car in real life. You think starting with a Mazda Roadster in GT3 was hard? Well, how about our Clio RL from earlier? That's what I'm talking about. And of course, the early events would be balanced around these cars, short races with a handful of opponents on the smaller, tighter circuits, but the key point being that the racing is still the main attraction. That's how you make these mundane cars fun, something which most other modern racing games have given up trying to do entirely. Remember the first few races in GT7? No, of course you don't, because they are deliberately nothing races that you're not supposed to care about. But then somehow the game expects you to care about the cars you're driving. Anyway, in terms of the overall career structure, I envision this as the typical Gran Turismo League format, which existed in GT1 and 2, but GT3 really solidified into the form we all know, and that would be used in various guises through to GT6 and even GT Sport. This is one element that I don't believe needs to be changed in a major way, but there are many details of it that can be improved. After the first event, the Sunday Cup equivalent, your next suitable options will be events based on the region and nationality of your car. This is so the choice you made initially with your starter car will already be having an influence by creating these diverging paths. Of course, your prize car from each of these events will be different, thus setting you up in a different way, and then you can continue doing more events with different cars, winning different cars, earning money to buy the cars you want to. The possibilities are endless. This is in essence the classic GT formula, but in a more streamlined way that quickly gets to the heart of the game and what makes it enjoyable. Now, when it comes to licenses, these will feature, but in a different way. In the first league, most events won't require a license, so you'll still have plenty of options in terms of which events to do. After buying your starter car and completing your first event, the option to do the license test will then open. The way they would work is that there would only be a few tests, maybe 3, but each of which would be fairly tough and would be a real test of your skill. The idea is that the races themselves would serve to prepare you for the tests, and as such would enable us to cut out the more tedious tests that previously only existed to teach the player basic driving techniques. In this sense, each test would be a true test of your abilities, rather than just a driving school. Now, in theory, you could get all of your licenses very early and skip ahead in the game, but there would be consequences to that, which we'll get to later. For now, let's talk more about the events themselves. What new and interesting things can we do here? Of course, we'll have a wide range of the usual event types. Events based on the drivetrain of your car, the age, the body style, nationality as already mentioned, engine type, one-make races, and just general performance. That's all fairly standard, but there are already a few ideas to consider here. The tracks chosen for each event will generally try and fit the theme. This can be in a very obvious way, like an event for Japanese cars taking place at mostly Japanese circuits, but also this can be done more subtly. For instance, an event featuring mid and rear-engined cars could focus more on tracks that are undulating and have many switchback corners. This puts an emphasis on weight transfer, and from this you would be able to see as a player what makes the MR and RR drivetrain cars unique from the other layouts. This is an example wherein having a handling model still grounded in reality will be important. But what about new event types? You may have noticed that the car list features many models which are base models of race and rally cars, and this is no coincidence. The plan would be to have events representing certain classes of racing and championships from all over the world, like GT4 race cars, Group A touring and rally cars, and even Group 4 GT and rally cars. All of the opponents would be done up to look like the real-life cars, although most likely with unlicensed liveries, similar to how GT Sport and GT7 does it. Motorsport in general would have a massive influence on this game. Qualifying would be an option for the longer races and championships when possible, and every race would start as either a standing grid start or a double file rolling start when more appropriate. In very wet conditions, a single file start may be used, but extremely drawn out grids, with gaps of up to multiple seconds, will obviously not be present. Other events in the career mode could be centered around well-known engine lines that have been used in many different models, like the PRV, Peugeot, Renault, Volvo units, or various Cosworth engines. There could also be events for low volume and one-off production cars, like the ones I mentioned earlier. One feature that is unique to GT3 that I would especially like to carry over is having multiple versions of events in different leagues. I enjoy this idea so much because what initially appear like duplicate events can be massively different experiences from one another, but with the same underlying theme and types of opponents to tie them together. It also offers a clear path of isolated progression, as you can choose to further upgrade your current car for the same event in the next league, or use the prize car, or save up some money to buy an entirely new car. If you want to, you can come up with a unique plan for how to deal with a line of events like these. Also, this idea isn't restricted to just the same event in different leagues, but ones that are clearly similar. For example, one-make race events featuring Renaults. Initially, there could be an event for basic front-wheel drive Renault Clios, and then in the next league, it's an event for the Renault Sport Spider, and then the next one up is the Renault Clio V6 Trophy. You have a clear path to follow, which will be supplemented by the respective prizes, but in which order you do unrelated events will affect your position in the game and the decisions you make. If you've watched my retrospective on the endurance races within Gran Turismo, you'll know that I consider them as quite important to the series overall. So, how would I handle them in my game? What I would do is have what I call feature races. Feature races, like endurance races in GT, would exist within their own league and would be individual races lasting between 30 minutes to 2 hours. So why not longer? Well, firstly is that as the game won't have the typical content you would expect to find for endurance races, like the tracks such as Le Sarthe and the Nürburgring, or cars like Le Mans prototypes, I don't feel like that's really necessary. The second is for gameplay. I want feature races to be a core part of the career that you can jump into at any time, not just relegated to the post-game once you've done pretty much everything else. For instance, here's how they could be introduced. So one of the events in the beginner league, or whatever it would be called, could be for Mazda Roadsters. It would just be a simple 3-race event, but upon completion, as well as a prize car, you would gain access to a feature race. Now this could either be again for Mazda Roadsters, or just Mazdas in general, but at a slightly higher performance bracket than the event in the beginner league. So you could either use your prize car or upgrade your current Mazda Roadster to use. You wouldn't be forced into doing the event, but based on the situation you would be in, you would then be encouraged to give it a go. And one of the reasons why I would want people to get into these races from an early stage is to show them what the game is capable of. These games can start off a little bit slow, both metaphorically and literally. The feature races would show people what they can expect going forwards, and there would be a few more generic races that are open at any time, provided you have the necessary license and a suitable car. There would be tyre wear, fuel usage, variable time in weather, mechanical damage and retirements, safety cars, just so many variables to consider that would spice up the racing. Now, I wouldn't want to overwhelm players with all of this, so initially these ideas would be there but on a basic level, and then as you progress to the later feature races with faster cars, you would have to start thinking about them more. Given the sheer number of variables, winning these races would be anything but a formality, so the next thing is how I would remove the fear of failure. In Gran Turismo and other racing games like it, you're expected to be winning races pretty much all the time. But given these variables, which will feature in later championship races as well, you're going to have to accept losing. So, how do we still make these races rewarding when the player can go into a multiple-hour feature race knowing that there's a good chance they won't even win? Other games like GT7 simply just give out the top prize for finishing in the top 3 positions. But I think that's pretty lame. So I would give out unique prizes for each of the top positions. First place would get a unique car, like a low-volume production car, which shows up very rarely in the used dealership, to a concept car which doesn't show up at all and can only be won as a prize. The next couple of positions can still give prize cars, but ones that are less rare and maybe not as fast. Then positions below that can give discounts for purchasing cars, with the percentage scaling down based on position, and then further below that it would be discounts for upgrades instead. In a race with 20 cars, for example, as long as you finish in the top 10, you would still be entitled to a unique prize. And of course there would be prize money as well, which would gradually scale downwards based on position, but not as severely as you would find in most other games. You would still get decent money for finishing in the lower positions, provided you complete at least 90% of the winner's total distance, just so people don't abuse this by finishing feature races and cars that are far too slow, just so they can get a decent payout in the early game without actually doing anything. But speaking of, that brings us to grid sizes. For me, the more the better. Ideally, we could have 30 plus cars on track. And again, this would be another benefit of the simplified visual design and models, which would make it far less intensive to achieve this. This would also allow us to flesh out multi-class races, which I would also want to implement. Again, that would be another variable in the feature races, but these could also be used in a few of the normal events. The way I envision it is that you could compete in one event in a league where there are 2 classes racing on one track, and you're in the slower class. But then you encounter the same event in a higher league, but now you're in the faster class of cars with the slower ones as traffic. I think that would be a really interesting dynamic. Another event format would be tournaments. This is partially inspired by the national events from the original Gran Turismo, which were US versus Japan or UK versus US, for example, and also team racing in various other games, say Mario Kart. The idea is simply that you're racing as part of a team based on your car selection. The completion of the event is still tied to your own results, so as long as you personally win, then the event is considered fully completed. But there will be bonuses for where your team finishes in the team points ranking. Here's an example. So we have the drivetrain events for FF, FR, 4-wheel drive, and MR/RR combined. After completing every drivetrain event in each of the leagues, you get an invitation to compete in the all drivetrain tournament in the highest league. So we've got our 4 drivetrain teams, if you were, and we can have 5 members of each team, making 20 cars in total. Whichever drivetrain of car that you bring, you will be entered as part of that team, and your teammates chosen at random from the pool of opponents using cars with the same drivetrain. It's a pretty simple idea that I think adds a new layer of intrigue, as teamwork will be incentivized, although you can just go as a lone wolf, as, like I say, your own result is all that matters for the actual completion of the event. Much like multi-class races, these won't be used super often, but can be sprinkled in there occasionally when it makes sense to add a little something more to your playthrough. Other event format ideas I have include events where your car choice is limited by the total amount of money spent on the car and nothing else, sort of like a budget car challenge. There's also more ideas inspired from real racing, like championships with multiple heat races, where one may be a reverse grid of the finishing order from the previous race, or even a reverse championship order. There's also the idea of handicaps, such as gaining ballast for every point you score in the championship. The biggest issue that I personally have with the older Gran Turismos, and by extension the newer ones as well, is that progression kind of dies by the final third of the game. At that point, you're into the higher end cars, and the game has shown you pretty much all of the mechanics it has to offer, so there isn't much more there to keep you hooked. The worst case of this is, ironically, with GT3. By the time you get to the professional league, the game has already shown its full hand. It has nothing left to offer. The races you'll find there are not too different from the amateur league ones, but now they're twice as long, so it's not surprising that a larger number of players kind of give up right there. And to their credit, it seems like the developers realised this also, given that you only need to complete each of the events in just the beginner and amateur leagues to reach the 2 sets of end credits. The idea for Leggera is that this sort of situation should never happen. As long as you have the desire and time to fully complete the game, you would have no reason not to. The game would always have something up its sleeve to introduce to keep things fresh. And it's not as if these variables purely exist for this purpose as gimmicks. I mention them because I truly believe that they would be excellent gameplay additions, many of which, as I say, are derived from real racing. So that's what I would change at least. I feel like each of these alterations are worthwhile and offer a clear purpose. They're not changes just for the sake of changing. GT7, in my opinion, does something like that with its World Circuits menu replacing the traditional League format. I'm not saying that the League format should never be replaced, but to me it's clear that they didn't really weigh up the positives and negatives before they made this decision. It's like GT7 wants to give off this impression of a globe-trotting expedition, but the actual gameplay doesn't reflect this, as everything you do is dictated by the order of the menu books anyway. It's not like the World Tour mode of Forza Motorsport 4, which was clearly trying to communicate this idea and thus expressed it through how you progress. The only benefit to GT7's World Circuits seems to be that it looks nice, and that's about it. Other than that, it's just sheer inconvenience. I mean, if you want to compete in the Race of Turbo Sports Cars event, for example, you can't just go to the event and pick out which race to do like before. You now have to remember exactly which circuits host the races for that event, and then go to those circuits to find them, or dig through each location trying to find them if you don't remember. It's abysmal. So that's my philosophy. If you want to make a change, you need to come up with a clear and concise reason for making that change, and then weigh up the positives and negatives of it to see if it's actually worth doing. If you just change things for the sake of change, you are almost guaranteed to inadvertently mess something up. One more final thing when it comes to the event structure is the bonus league. Frankly, I'm kind of shocked that Gran Turismo has never had a proper bonus league before. It just seems like such an obvious idea. Maybe you could consider the Endurance League as a bonus league, but I'm imagining something a bit different. So after completing the main campaign, you would then unlock the bonus league. What the bonus league would be is a set of new events that are more experimental and challenging than what you would find in the normal leagues, reserved only for the most dedicated players. Here's a few examples. One could be a long 10-race championship featuring the slowest cars in the game, but with massive 30+ car grids on the biggest circuits and all of the possible variables I've already mentioned. It would be sort of like the Professional League Vitz Race Championship from GT3, but with that idea taken to its most extreme. There could also be an event with the most powerful cars in the game, but taking place exclusively at the shortest and tightest circuits. We could also play around with the event format a bit more, like having a sort of relay race where you have to enter with multiple cars, and every few laps you need to pit and change cars. Those are just a few ideas that I came up with, but there's so much more that can be done with this concept to create some truly unique and fascinating events that would normally be too ridiculous to put in the main leagues. Of course, these will be quite niche, but I feel like if you're the type of player who would be able to get to the point of unlocking the bonus league, it's exactly the sort of thing that you would enjoy. Okay, so that's the outline for the main campaign, but don't you think there's something important that I've yet to really mention? That's right, the AI opponents. Now, obviously, they would be very important in making my single-player vision become a reality. But to be honest, I don't have too many specific points to make about them. It all just boils down to, I want them to be good. I want them to understand racecraft and race well. I want them to be fast and consistent. I want them to occasionally make mistakes like real drivers do. I want them to be good. But how we would go about doing that, I'm not entirely sure. What I do know for certain though, is that even if making solid AI drivers isn't the easiest thing in the world, I'm certain that they can still be far better than what we have with most racing games at the moment. With the exception of very experimental and limited systems like GT Sophie, the AI in racing games has barely changed in the past 10 years, maybe even longer. And that's bizarre to think about, because I personally believe they are so crucial to the single-player experience. So you have my word that my hypothetical game would have the best hypothetical AI that me and my talented hypothetical team could possibly create. But assuming we could create this impressive AI which I envisage, how would we use it in the game? So if we're talking about the main campaign, there's a few things to unpack. Firstly, let's talk options. Now, this may surprise you, but I think it's way more interesting if you don't let the player tailor the experience to themselves. Now, I don't mean driver assists here. People should be able to have the driving experience they want to with these games. I'm more talking about the experience people have with playing through these games. It's the idea of a unique experience versus a curated experience. I believe that if you let the player tailor the experience to themselves too much, you kind of lose some of the identity of the game. My ideal situation is where you're restricted into having curated situations, such as the events themselves, the opponents you come up against, etc., but at the same time, you're given enough freedom to come up with solutions to these situations how you want to, like using different cars or different strategies. And this is partly what I believe makes talking about experiences from past GT games so interesting, like the insane difficulty of the Speedster Trophy in GT4, for example. If you could just change the difficulty at will, that would make it less frustrating, sure, but a lot of the identity and lore built from that event is gone. It's just not as interesting. Same idea if you could just remove tyre wear from events at will, or decide the weather scenario. It's a unique experience, yes, but in this sense, the game design has been made redundant. What's the point in making these choices if the player can just override them entirely? The AI is a less clear-cut example, because not giving as many options here can lead to disaster if you get the balance wrong. Having AI that is inconsistent, causing you to change the difficulty for almost every race, is not great. But having the same thing happen without the ability to change the difficulty is catastrophic. So naturally, a lot of time will need to be put into balancing them if this is what I intend to do. But I believe the end result would be worth it. Of course, there are various tools that can be used to make balancing them easier, such as manipulating their speed relative to the player. This is something that I have lamented very openly in GT7, but I will concede that there are some situations where it can make sense. I believe that as long as you're subtle about it, to the point that players will never really notice it, then that's fine. Of course, GT7's AI somehow getting 20 seconds a lap slower when the player falls behind doesn't exactly fit into this, but here's an example where it can work. In many racing games, when doing a long race, most people will often start at a certain speed and then get gradually faster as they get more comfortable with the car and track. This has happened to me many times in Gran Turismo's endurance races, where I'll start the race and feel very well matched with the opponents, but then I just get gradually faster and faster until I'm lapping them by lap 20. In this case, a small amount of deliberate manipulation can go a long way, say increasing their speed by up to 2 seconds a lap across 10 laps, so gaining roughly 0.2 seconds every lap, provided the player is increasing their speed noticeably as well. As long as you don't go over the top with it, then this can be a great solution. Another solution is again giving players more freedom to find their own solutions. A car performance rating system has become ubiquitous in these types of racing games, whether it be the performance points in Gran Turismo or performance index in Forza. Now, these rating systems do make things a lot simpler and more convenient for the player, but in my opinion, a lot more boring also. You often don't need to do much thinking, just add upgrades until you reach the target number, job done. In my game, there would still be a performance rating system, but it wouldn't be used in the main campaign or be visible to the player. One use for it would be for designing events and choosing opponents with roughly similar performance. From a player's perspective though, everything would be displayed based on a car's power, weight, and maybe a couple of other metrics like tyre grip and total downforce. These metrics for opponent cars would be visible, so that it's still a lot easier to balance yourself with them in events than it was in the older GT games, but it would still require you to actually think and not just stare at a single number. Some events would have performance restrictions based on these metrics, and a couple of other factors, like the grade of upgrade parts used, such as sports versus racing. But there would still be enough freedom to create unique builds and have inventive solutions for each event. The point I'm making is that the restrictions won't be so severe that you're always on a level playing field with the AI. It may take a bit of work, but the idea is that if you maximize the performance of your car within the variables you're given for each event, your car will always end up slightly faster than the next best opponents, meaning that if you're struggling with an event, you'll always have that joker card to play to make it a bit easier, while still being incentivized to race them on an even level, at least initially. Some games give more freedom, but then hand out direct rewards for using slower cars, like cash or XP bonuses. But I've never liked this solution, as it means that you create a trade-off between having more challenging races or a more challenging playthrough. You can't have both at the same time, which is frustrating for someone like me who enjoys challenge on both of those levels. One mechanic I would want to have with the AI is a respect or reputation meter. Many games have already tried this, but they're often pretty binary. Either the AI are completely passive, or they're out for blood. If I were to include this system, it would be far more incremental. Obviously, driving dirty will cause the AI to lose respect towards you, and this will be individual to each AI driver, so you'll gradually see them become more aggressive. They won't try to ram you off the road or anything, but they will generally leave you a bit less space and be more prone to turning in on you if you try to dive down the inside, that sort of thing. This will also be tied to your experience somewhat. Remember when I said that doing licenses very early in the game and trying to skip ahead to the later events would have consequences? Well, this is how. No matter how well designed the game is, there will almost always be some sort of exploit to progress faster than expected. With Leggera, if you find a way to do that, you won't be blocked off by level caps or completion requirements, but you will find out that the majority of AI drivers in these tougher events will be predisposed to have very low respect towards you. Of course, you can still improve this by driving cleanly against them, but obviously this will make things a lot tougher. I think this idea is pretty cool, because it's sort of like a natural skill cap. Since if you are a good driver, you can still get around this and get good results in these tougher events. But if not, then it shows that you do still belong in the lower leagues. But at least you have the chance to prove yourself instead of the game just blocking you off entirely. The AI drivers themselves would exist simply as their name, nationality, and maybe helmet design. Nothing more. They would have no dialogue, no backstory, nothing. The reason for this is that I'm a big fan of passive storytelling. Essentially, everything you know about these drivers would be based purely on what you can see when they appear in the events, which events they appear in, which cars they tend to drive, and their respect towards you. If you watch a lot of video essays on video games, you would have heard the term ludonarrative dissonance. Basically, this just means that the story that the game is trying to portray is in conflict to what's actually happening in the gameplay, and racing games have always been rife with this. How many times have you played the latest Need for Speed or other story-driven racing game and seen the final boss built up as this formidable opponent throughout the game? Then you get to the final race and they're just a complete pushover because their AI isn't very good. It's kind of embarrassing. And also, immersion breaking. With my game, that won't be an issue, because there's no defined story. But just because there's no story doesn't mean that there won't be any characters, at least in the player's mind. The idea is that as we have these unique recurring opponents, all of the tools are there for people to create their own headcanons based on their own experiences with them and the limited information they've been given. Of course, many people won't think this way, and this will all just go over their head, but I think for people like me who do this when we play these games, it can make the experience of playing through the game a lot more meaningful and personal. Here's an example of how this could work. Say there's an AI driver who you come up against quite often in the beginner league, who's one of the top drivers and has a pretty fast car. But when you reach the amateur league, they're mysteriously absent despite many other top drivers from the beginner league making that jump. From this, you might interpret that they have a complex about being a big fish in a small pond, and perhaps the car they drive, and how it's been modified, might play into your own personal biases to make you think this way. Perhaps they were unexpectedly aggressive when you raced against them. That could play into it as well. And that's your headcanon. It also leaves you wondering if they might return, and if so, in which event. Just really subtle things like this that add so much flavour if you're inclined to think that way. If you think about other genres of games, part of the excitement in the gameplay comes from the anticipation, such as, if you're heading into a boss fight, why are you fighting? What are the stakes? And how the game uses these ideas in the build-up to a fight, a lot of the time, is what makes it so captivating. Your relation with the AI opponents is surely a factor here, but there can be others, such as having a cinematic intro for certain races and championships. GT7 actually introduced this to Gran Turismo for the first time, and I think it's a great idea that could have been utilised even more. Not only does it hype you up, but it also gives each championship a unique atmosphere and personality, sort of like an extension of the event banner images that GT3 once again fully introduced. Another area where this can be expanded is in the short vignettes at the end of each race. GT Sport did these first, but I believe GT7 was the first to do them for single player races as well. Just a short animation that changes based on which position you finished. I like these, and with them we could incorporate the other drivers you were racing against. So, depending on which drivers finished around you, and what level of respect they have for you, there would be unique animations for each situation, such as shaking each other's hands, walking past each other awkwardly, or having a heated discussion about what happened if you managed to piss them off. Provided the systems which record how you interact with other drivers on track, and their respect towards you, are reasonably accurate, then ludonarrative dissonance is not a worry, as your own headcanons should be based on things that you can observe and that have actually happened, not because the game is telling you how these drivers act and what they think. When it comes to single-player content, one could argue that what I've already outlined would be plenty enough. But I don't do things by halves. So what I have for you next is my own take on mission mode, which I call challenge mode. Challenge mode, like missions in Gran Turismo, are separate from the main career, but still impactful to some degree. They would open up at some point during the main career, and you would be able to earn money and prizes from them as well. This mode could be broken down into 3 sections: attack, defense, and battle. So, much like the missions in GT, this is a scenario mode. But the difference here is that every scenario would take place in a racing situation. Let's start with attack, as that will be the first to unlock. Attack simply focuses on scenarios where you'll be starting behind some cars, and your goal will be to overtake them and finish as high as possible. Pretty simple. But as you complete these missions and move on, they will again start to get more complex with more variables to account for. The basic idea is that you're in a favourable position compared to the cars in front. Whether your car is simply faster, better suited to the track, you have more fuel to use, you're on less warm tyres, they have a mechanical issue, they're losing time in traffic. It can be anything really. The challenge is of course to use your advantage to catch and overtake them. The idea of challenge mode is to have these scenarios in live racing situations. For instance, in GT7, you may have a mission where you need to overtake some cars, but this is always an isolated scenario where only those few cars are on track and it ends at a set point. With challenge mode, you're always dumped into an ongoing race, including other cars that you're not even racing. The car is provided for the challenge and the rest is up to you. The idea of this mode is to show how these variables in the game can lead to interesting racing situations, essentially throwing you into the thick of the action. They're the sort of interesting scenarios that may occur over the course of the longer feature races. The purpose of this, beyond simply being a fun game mode, is twofold. First is simply to show the game at its best and most compelling. The second is to demonstrate the potential of the longer feature races within the main career to someone who may not have been interested in them originally. It would be the idea of people taking on these curated challenges and then thinking, wow, I didn't know the game was capable of doing this, that's really interesting. That's the sort of reaction I'd be aiming for anyway. And even if that still doesn't motivate people to try out the longer races in the main career, at least they would get to experience these situations in this much more streamlined form. Attack would be the first section that unlocks, and then later the defense section would open up. Defense challenges, as the name implies, are just the opposite of attack. You are now the car starting in front, but with some sort of handicap, meaning the cars behind will be faster, and your goal is to hold on to as many positions as you can. I feel like defense is an often overlooked aspect in single-player racing games, but is of course a very crucial thing in real life. In most cases, I believe that defending your position is harder than overtaking, hence why I would introduce the attack challenges first. The behaviour of the AI opponents will be crucial here, since a big amount of the difficulty will be based on their ability to actually overtake you should they get the chance, so their racecraft has to be on point. Now, I know what you're thinking, couldn't I just block them like I do in most other racing games? Well, yes, but again, there would be consequences. I would want there to be some sort of system that can detect when the player is blocking the AI excessively, swerving across the track, or running them off the road. Using this system, we could penalise players based on these actions, but I think the more interesting option would be to utilise the respect mechanic I outlined earlier. When the game detects that you're driving in an unfair and erratic way towards the AI trying to overtake, this will decrease their respect meter and cause them to drive more aggressively. This could take the form of them braking later and trying to force their own gaps open so they can overtake you. It's worth noting that these respect levels would be isolated to these challenges, so every AI would start off as passive towards the player until provoked, and their state wouldn't carry across to the other challenges either. The third and final level is Battle. Battle is simply both attack and defense combined. You'll have slower cars in front and faster cars behind, with your goal to finish as high as possible. In essence, you'd have to keep one eye looking forwards as you try to make up positions, and one eye on your mirrors as the faster cars close in and try to overtake you. There may even be the possibility for scenarios where the dynamic changes partway through, so maybe due to strategy, you might spend the first part of the scenario attacking and moving forwards, and then the second half you could be defending from those same opponents. There is potential here for this mode to get really frantic, but to be honest, that's kind of the point. Did you think I was finished with the single player content? Not at all. So far, what I've talked about with the main career and challenge mode are iterations of things that have already been in Gran Turismo and other racing games like it. My next game mode takes inspiration from various other titles, but is still something entirely new. So I present to you Track Day mode. As you play through the main career, you will gradually unlock all of the tracks to drive at your leisure in modes like Time Trial and Quick Race, but another option you'll have under that will be Track Day. Now, for me to explain what the Track Day mode would be, the best way is to first visualize a real-life track day. So, you turn up at the circuit with your car, and there'll be other drivers with their own cars just doing laps. So, if we talk about what the purpose of Track Day mode would be, let's start on the very basic end. Say you have a car and want to go for a test drive, but don't want to enter it into a proper race. But at the same time, you find just driving around on your own in Time Trial a bit boring. In this case, you could head over to Track Day mode, pick a track which you've unlocked, and start driving with other AI drivers just doing their own thing. The AI cars that turn up will be balanced around the performance of your car. They will be fairly similar in performance to your car, but there will also be a slight spread of cars which are a bit faster and a bit slower than you, kind of like a real track day. The only exceptions would be if you bring one of the absolute slowest cars in the game, or one of the absolute fastest. This is also another case where having a performance rating system behind the scenes will be useful. That would be track day mode's most basic function, but it would be capable of so much more than that. So, let's talk about the more interesting ways in which the AI can be used here. Of course, the AI that actually turn up will mostly be ones that are relevant to that circuit, whether it's due to their nationality or the type of car they drive. Again, this is another way in which you can build your own headcanon for them if you want to. Something I remember seeing for the first time in Tokyo Extreme Racer Drift 2 was the parking areas. Essentially, the way it worked in that game was that you would head to a toge, or mounted pass, and arrive at the respective parking area where you would find various drivers who you could challenge. Once you accepted a challenge, you would then race them on the toge. Beating drivers unlocked more drivers to challenge, and so on. I would want to do something similar in track day mode. My version would have you in the pits and paddock area at each track, being able to see all of the drivers who turned up to the track day. From there, you could view their stats and details about their car. In my version, they wouldn't talk to you directly to challenge you, but there would be some form of bulletin board where challenges would be posted. These can range from fairly generic challenges like race me or try to beat my lap time, to more specific ones like I want to race someone driving this specific type of car, or someone who only shows up to challenge you when it's raining. Some challenges could unlock sequentially, such as after beating a challenge from a certain driver, you receive another challenge from them or another driver that's a bit more difficult. Maybe they're driving a slightly faster car, for example. There would also be challenges that unlock passively after doing certain things at the track day, like driving a cumulative 10 laps or achieving a certain lap time. And only after doing these would you be challenged by certain drivers who would then deem you worthy. When it comes to challenges where you're racing them, I would avoid making this a basic 1v1. The reason being that although 1v1s in racing games can be pretty intense, a lot of the time they just fall completely flat if either driver has any noticeable advantage. So what I would do is have the race still technically be a 1v1 against that specific driver, but it takes place on a live track with other cars still driving around. In this sense, it adds context to this being a track day. The circuit isn't reserved for you to do whatever you want to, it's for everyone, whilst also preventing the races from getting too dull. The same would apply when it comes to lap time challenges. There would be traffic to negotiate, and all of this would have to be factored in. So unlocking tracks and their respective track days would be done through the main career, but the unlocking of the challenges from drivers would all be self-contained to the track day mode. Of course, the level of respect each driver has for you from the main career would be carried across to this mode as well. But I also plan for there to be drivers who are unique to the track day mode. These could take the form of references to real-life drivers and even other racing game franchises. Combined with a cast of recurring opponents and their own unique cars, the possibilities for challenges are really endless. When it comes to rewarding the player in this mode, there would be modest payouts for completing challenges, but the bigger rewards would be for completing full sets of challenges. When I say full sets, I mean that certain important drivers at each track day would give you a series of multiple challenges, which could also involve other drivers at points. Only after completing the full series would you then receive the best rewards. What I picture as rewards for this are things like engine and drivetrain swaps. Yes, they would be in this game, I'll talk more about them in a moment, and possibly even the uniquely tuned cars that your opponents drive. Basically, I would want these rewards to be truly unique to this game mode, thus incentivizing people to play it, whilst also making the rewards feel more personal, given the personal nature of receiving challenges from other drivers. So, to summarize, track day mode is inspired by real-life track days, the parking areas from Tokyo Extreme Racer Drift, and even the race days from Need for Speed Pro Street, but with my own spin and personal touch added to it. I believe that this game mode would be something truly unique to this style of racing game, leading to people interacting with it in different ways and surely creating even more unique experiences for the players. Well, that finally does it for the single player, but we still have more to cover. So, something else you might have noticed that I've yet to mention explicitly is that the car list only features road cars. And whilst that is true, it wouldn't necessarily be true to then say that there would be no race cars in this game. Something that Gran Turismo and many other racing games like it have always done is have this divide between race cars and road cars. In the first couple of GTs, you could convert a road car into a race car, but this was done as one single modification that would only add downforce as well as the visual differences. In the other games, race cars and road cars are kept entirely distinct from one another. In the older games, this wasn't a big deal, but if you look at it in current day with GT7, you can take a road car, fully upgrade it with racing parts like tyres, suspension, brakes, and engine upgrades, then make it look the part with custom aero, wheels, liveries, and other details, and despite all of that, it will still be considered a road car. Why? There's no real reason anymore. This classification is just a divide which makes certain cars less useful. The point is that in my game, there would be no divide. All of the cars are road cars by nature in their stock form, but when you upgrade them, you can effectively turn them into anything you want them to be. The only classification to consider is what grade of parts you use on the car, like sports, semi-racing, and full racing. But just because you put racing tyres on your road car doesn't inherently make it a race car, it simply is what it is. That said, I do plan for there to be certain events which limit the level of parts you can use, or even certain events which mandate a minimum spec of parts, i.e. you must have racing tyres, suspension, brakes, and muffler to compete in a professional touring car series. But regardless, upgrades, tuning, and customization would be a very crucial part of my game. That said, I don't have too many specific ideas for how to handle them beyond some very minor things, like being able to fit stock wheels from other cars, or being able to create negative decals or cutouts in the livery editor. One thing I would do though is to allow you to save full car presets. In GT7, for example, you can save tuning presets which can be loaded at any time. But I would take this one step further and create full car presets which include all of the customization as well as fitted upgrades and tuning. As long as you own the necessary parts, you can switch between these presets at will. This would prevent situations where you may own multiple versions of certain cars simply for the convenience of switching between them at any time, something which I'm very much guilty of in GT7. The only restriction I would apply to this would be when it comes to engine and drivetrain swaps. You could still switch between them at will, but there would be a service charge for changing the engine and drivetrain layout each time. You of course wouldn't have to buy an all-new engine or drivetrain swap each time, so it's purely a nominal fee to avoid making the preset system too broken when it comes to these swaps. Speaking of the swaps, I explained how they would be handed out as prizes in track day mode, but what form would they come in? Well, I'm not very fond of Forza's way of having these generic swaps that can be done to almost every car, like an all-wheel drive swap for instance. It kind of makes things pretty arbitrary if you know that you can almost always do the same types of swaps for each of the cars. They start to lose their own identity. So the engine and drivetrain swaps that I would feature would mostly be ones derived from real cars, like doing a rear-wheel drive conversion on the R35 GTR, just like the real GT3 race car, or the Mark IV Toyota Supra having the option for a turbocharged inline-4 and naturally aspirated V8, as these were infamously the engine layouts it actually raced with back in the JGTC days. Other swaps would be ones that are fairly common for people to do in real life, like with the Honda K-Series or GM's LS engines. There could also be a few oddball ones that are thrown in there for fun. The idea is that every swap would have a purpose and be somewhat unique, rather than just a formality. Some cars would have swaps that you're not expecting, and others might not, but that's just part of what makes them special. And of course, the way you would earn them, through track day mode, would only add to that mystique. I will admit that GT7 is a lot better about having unique engine swaps, but as they continue to add more, there is potential for them to fall into the same trap as Forza. On the whole though, GT7's upgrades and customization are pretty solid, even if they could be improved in some areas. So my ideal situation would be to do something similar as a basis, and then just tweak it in a few minor ways. There's no need to majorly reinvent the upgrade system, for the purposes of Leggera anyway. Who here misses arcade mode in racing games? I do. Some racing games still use the arcade mode tagline, but these are nothing more than a glorified free play. When I say arcade mode, I mean an actual game mode that's distinct from the main campaign, ideally with its own basic form of progression. I really didn't need to do this, but I thought it'd be fun to come up with my own arcade mode blueprint for Leggera. The idea is pretty simple. If we go back to GT3 and the arcade mode present in that game, you win races at each track to unlock the next stage of tracks and more cars to use. The idea I have is basically that, but on a much larger scale. Similar to GT3, each of the cars would have a general performance class, like Class A, Class B, Class C, etc. To start with, you would have a few cars in each class, and by completing races you would earn more. The difference is that you would earn cars at random, albeit not entirely random, since for completing one stage, you might earn 2 cars in Class B, for example. But these can be any Class B cars within the game. So the idea is that you'll still be rewarded with cars of similar performance, but any given person's playthrough of arcade mode will be slightly different due to this element of luck. The tracks, on the other hand, would most likely unlock in a set order, with harder tracks unlocking later on. When it comes to the races themselves, you'll be given a set race for each track, lasting say roughly 5 minutes as a default, but you can customize the race if you want to. So the way this will work is that instead of simply winning a single race at each track and then moving on, you'll have to earn points to reach the next level before getting your rewards, like new cars and tracks, and then moving on. The default race you'll be offered will give you enough points for this if you win, but depending on which car you choose in each class, you can get bonus points. The bonus points awarded will be for using lower performance cars within each class. This is another area where having a performance rating system in the background will be useful, as naturally the cars within each class will have a range of performance, so this still incentivizes people to use lower performance cars so that they can earn more bonus points. The idea is that although you only need to get enough points to finish level 1 of each track and be awarded more tracks and eventually reach the end of arcade mode, you could keep doing races and earning points at each track, leveling up even further and earning even more cars. The reason why this could work is because my idea is that the stock form of every single car in the game could be earned eventually, provided you do enough races. Now, the vast majority of people won't do that, but some might. And why might they? Well, this is because part of my idea for arcade mode is that Custom Race would be integrated within it. Custom Race in GT7 allows you to create your own races, but one problem has always been the really low payouts, which means that you're not really encouraged to use it. But many people do anyway because they enjoy making their own races. Whilst the low payouts obviously aren't good, it does beg the question of why Custom Race gives out money at all. Because if the payouts were good, then that kind of reduces the importance of the main career if you can just do Custom Race and make money that way instead. One solution could be to only increase payouts once players have completed the main career, but I think that making it part of the separate arcade mode instead is more fun. You would still have all of the options to create the specific race that you want to, but now you'll be earning points from them which add to your arcade mode total and the total for that specific track. And as I say, more points means more leveling up, which means more cars, and you can keep doing this until you earn every car in the game. How many points each race gives will be determined by the length of the race, the difficulty, the car that you're driving versus what your opponents have, and various other options, in the same way that the prize money for Custom Race in GT7 is determined. So this gives you plenty of reason to do custom races, and with the bonus that the cars you earn can then be used in your custom races as opponents. If you use Custom Race in GT7 regularly, you'll know that the ability to choose opponent cars from any car in the game, without already having to own it, would be a very useful feature. So this somewhat solves that, and gives you more to work towards by completing custom races. Of course, you can still use the cars from your garage from the main single player mode in Custom Race as well. Arcade mode would also house another feature, which would be a hybrid between the event generator from Gran Turismo 2 and shuffle races from Gran Turismo 5. Basically, there would be a button on the main arcade mode menu that would say, "Give me a race," and upon pressing it, you would go to a menu that would have a few basic options. One would be a time requirement, where you would have a slider which you can move to input roughly how long you want the race to be. You would have the option to use a specific car or let the game decide for you. You could choose a rough performance level, like Class A, Class B, etc., or leave it to random, and a few other basic options like if you want to include ovals, for example. After deciding on these few options, you would then hit start, and the game would generate a race for you, including the track, opponent cars, conditions, and length, roughly based on the settings you chose. This would just be a fun side mode where if you've got a little bit of time to kill and want to do a race, but don't want the hassle of having to choose all of the settings yourself, you can just let the game do it for you. It's pretty simple, but I hope that it may end up with people driving unexpected car and track combinations against interesting opponent cars that they may have never chosen on their own volition in custom race. Before we wrap this up, I just want to touch on the online aspect of the game. When it comes to game design, I've always been much more interested in the offline portion, but it would be extremely foolish to release a game of this scope in this day and age without any online play. So here's a brief outline of what I would do. Would I cater to the esports crowd? No, they are already spoilt for choice. To gear the online play around the competitive scene would be a massive waste in my opinion, given just how many racing games currently do that. So, the goal would be to serve everyone else who, when it comes to Gran Turismo at least, may feel left out by the whole online experience being geared in this direction. The lobby system is the key to how many people enjoy online play in these games, so naturally, that's where I would focus the most time and effort. I would try and serve three main demographics with this. The first being players who aren't that interested in racing and just want to hop on the game to mess around and hang out with their friends and other random players. The second would be those who are interested in more casual racing, people who want to join lobbies randomly and race whatever cars they want to in a very low stakes environment. And the third would be league racers, people who enjoy more serious racing but also believe that the people they do that racing with and being part of a community matters as well. Each of these groups are connected by the lobbies, so that has to be the priority. That's not to say that we couldn't have a more structured quick race feature, like the daily races in Gran Turismo, but that would be secondary. Getting the lobbies to be stable and making it the best experience possible to keep players coming back to it would be the #1 goal. Having more features that everyone can enjoy would be key. I've already mentioned shuffle races from GT5 when talking about arcade mode. Shuffle races were races wherein you were given a random car from a limited pool of options that were all roughly similar in terms of performance. It was great fun. More fun game modes and options like these are what I would be aiming to include. I would also love to have some sort of in-game community feature, like Forza has with the clubs, and that was also present in GT6. That makes it easier for groups of people to set up events within the game. Pretty much all of the current community features you can find in GT7 I would also want in my game, but again, I don't have any specific ideas to really add to that. Talking about the online aspect, what about downloadable content? I am not at all a fan of the live service model. In most cases, it's just a way for developers to drip feed players content that should have been in the game from the start. To consider making my game a live service would feel like an insult, frankly. Given the amount of content I would want to pack it with, regular content updates would not be necessary. But I wouldn't be against expanding the game in some areas further down the line. I said that it was a painful decision to not include more classic cars. Well, here's my outline for what a World Classic Car DLC pack could look like. 10 cars as a paid DLC pack. A pretty retro idea by today's gaming standards. At the same time this would go on sale, there would also be an update available to all players, which would add a set of new classic car themed events into the main career, and maybe even a new circuit if we were being very generous. Given that there are still a few 1970s models in the original list, the events would still be doable without buying the DLC. These new events would also be added to a new league separate from the rest in the main career. The reason for this is so that the completion requirements for the base game stay the same, since if you have these moving goalposts when it comes to overall completion, that makes it feel a bit meaningless. So I would want to track the completion of DLC events separately. In theory, we could even add all new racing disciplines this way, like drifting, toge battles, actual rally including gravel and snow courses, and more. This way, Leggera would not only be a full game in its own right, but could still serve as a basis to be expanded on, whether through these updates, or potentially even a sequel. Well, that's about all I have to show you guys. As you might be able to tell, I spent a lot of time over the past few months thinking about this game idea and really focusing in on the details. Games like these mean a lot to me, so I really wanted to do them justice in my game proposal by explaining each design choice and why I think they could work. The hardest part of making this concept was trying to be realistic about what would be possible. As I said at the start of this video, I tried to come up with all of this based on the assumption of having a small but dedicated team of people working on it, and plenty of time to realise these ideas. As such, I did place some restrictions on myself as to how much I could come up with. There's a bunch of smaller details and other ideas that I just couldn't fit into this video, or simply didn't know if they would have been realistic. For example, one idea I had was for split screen, not just to include it, but also to have it be functional in the main career. In theory, you could play through the whole career as 2 players, entering 2 cars in each event, but I don't know how feasible that would really be. So yeah, if there was some aspect that I didn't really talk about, just assume that I didn't have much to say about it, or any ideas I had were maybe a little too far beyond the scope of what would actually be possible. Of course, game development isn't as simple as just saying what you intend to do and then making the game exactly as you imagine. It's a tough industry. Nobody would try and create a game of this scale as their first title. That's practically unheard of. Not to mention how such a thing would be funded, and if you manage to get a publisher on board, then what sort of requests and alterations they may want you to make. There are so many more variables to consider than what I've outlined here. But anyway, tell me all what you think in the comments. What do you think would work, and what might not work? Would any of these decisions contradict other design choices? Until these things are tested together, we'll never fully know if they actually work as intended. Bear in mind, these are ideas that I've come up with by myself, of course inspired by many different games. If this game were to be made, it would be with a team of people, each with their own inspirations and game design philosophy, who would undoubtedly bring their own unique ideas to the table. In this sense, the potential for the game would be even higher than what I've outlined here. Still, I'm really proud of what I've come up with, and I truly believe that if this were made into a real game, it would represent something truly unique and interesting in the racing game sphere. I've talked about innovation when it comes to racing games in the past, but some people seem to get the wrong idea. Innovation doesn't just mean radically changing things and coming up with completely clean sheet ideas. You can innovate in much more isolated ways. I feel like with Project Leggera, this is what I've intended to do. On the surface, it may just seem like an homage to my favourite racing game of all time, but beneath that, you'll begin to understand that practically every facet of the game has been tweaked, improved, or added to in some way, so that you would end up with an experience that is truly individual. It would definitely be a game that's structured more towards experienced racing game fans, that's for sure. Modern racing games have gotten into a trend of simplifying their experience to try and appeal to a wider audience, but by doing that, they often dilute the aspects of the game that made many of us fall in love with it in the first place, and as such, they just end up making the game worse. My hope for Leggera would be the opposite, a game that is hyper-focused on the aspects that actually make this type of game enjoyable to play. And in some ways, that may appeal to a wider audience regardless by simply being a well-designed game. Not just good by racing game standards, but just in general. The type of game that, even if you have no interest in cars or motorsport whatsoever, you can still appreciate as being a fundamentally engaging experience. And yes, I do believe that if it could be pulled off, it would actually be far better than Gran Turismo 3, or any other Gran Turismo for that matter. Well, regardless of if you agree with that or not, you should still be able to see just how passionate I am about these racing games. Anyway, this video has gone on for about long enough. Please let me know if you managed to make it all the way to the end, and if I should make more videos like these. I have rough ideas for more types of racing games, like my own take on an open world racer, one based on a real motorsport series, like the Formula 1 games for example, and even something completely different that you've likely never seen before. So there's plenty more to look forward to. But for now, have a good one.